The HOA gave me 21 days to tear out my rainwater system, or they were going to fine me, put a lien on my house, and, as their attorney so politely phrased it, pursue every available remedy under community law. So I paid the first fine before lunch, smiled at the receipt, and spent the rest of the afternoon ordering a bigger storage tank. Looking back now, I probably should have been more diplomatic, maybe brought cookies to the board meeting or acted confused and harmless. But at the time, all I could think was, you people are trying to control water that might not even be yours. My name is Owen Mercer, and I live, or I guess I should say, I survived, in a little desert subdivision called Silverthorne Ranch, about an hour outside Las Cruces, New Mexico, the kind of place real estate agents describe with words like peaceful, elevated, private, and surrounded by nature, which is a fancy way of saying there is nothing out there but rock, wind, snakes, and neighbors who can see your trash cans from 3 streets over. When my wife passed a few years back, I did what a lot of men in their 50s do when they do not know how to grieve properly. I bought a house that was too quiet and convinced myself solitude was the same thing as healing. Silverthorne looked good on paper. Low density, big skies, orange sunsets that made the whole ridge glow like hot copper, and enough space between houses that nobody could pretend they were accidentally hearing your business. What the brochure did not say in bold letters was that all 56 homes in that subdivision depended on one shared well, one old well drilled back when people still believed the desert would keep giving forever if you just asked it nicely. Every month, each homeowner paid the association a water maintenance fee, and every month the HOA acted like it was doing us a personal favor by letting water come out of the taps. Now, I was not exactly the average buyer in that neighborhood. I had spent 30 years working as a groundwater surveyor and later as a consultant for ranches, counties, and small towns that had waited too long to start worrying about water. I knew how aquifers moved, how wells failed, how old land records could sit quietly in county offices like loaded weapons nobody remembered were there. So when I bought my place, I did not just look at the kitchen, the roof, or whether the garage could fit my truck. I read the deed, all of it, and tucked in the old language from when the land was still part of the Marlow cattle tract. There was a section about retained subsurface water interests, not vague access, not some decorative legal phrase, but real documented rights that extended under parts of the old ranch parcel. Most people would have skimmed right past it. The previous owner certainly had. But I remember sitting there at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, reading that paragraph twice, and thinking, well, that is interesting. At first, I did nothing with it. I had no plan to start a neighborhood war. I wanted tomatoes, quiet mornings, and maybe, if I was lucky, a way to stop waking up at 3 a.m. thinking about hospital rooms. My first real friend there was a guy named Hank Bell, retired highway patrol. Thick mustache, bad knees, and the kind of laugh that made you forgive him for borrowing tools and returning them with dirt still on the handles. Hank lived 2 doors down, and about a week after I moved in, he wandered over while I was fixing a sagging gate and said, "Just so you know, Marla Griggs runs this HOA like it is a federal agency." I said, "Marla, who?" He pointed with his beer bottle toward the stucco clubhouse near the front entrance and said, "President of the board, Queen of beige paint, terror of visible garden hoses, and currently the reason my mailbox is 1 shade of brown away from a violation." I laughed because I thought he was exaggerating. That was my first mistake. The rainwater system started as a practical thing, not a protest. Desert rain is strange. If you have never lived with it, you can go weeks with the sky looking like an empty plate. Then, one afternoon, the clouds roll in, the temperature drops, and suddenly water is hammering your roof like somebody upstairs opened a fire hose. 10 minutes later, it is gone, rushing down the street, cutting little rivers through gravel, disappearing into sand that will be dry again before dinner. It always bothered me, all that water arriving in one violent little miracle and nobody catching it. So I designed a system for my own property, gutters tied into screened downspouts, downspouts feeding underground lines running into a buried 12,000-gallon cistern behind the house, sealed, filtered, clean enough for irrigation, and, with the right treatment, usable in an emergency. I pulled the permits that were actually required, hired a licensed crew for the excavation, and kept everything low profile. From the road, you could not see a thing except new gutters. and even those matched the trim because I'm not a complete animal. For the first month, nobody said a word. I actually thought maybe Silverthorne was going to let me live in peace. Then came the certified letter. It was printed on heavy cream paper with the HOA seal at the top, which I always found funny because nothing says community quite like spending extra money on stationery used to threaten your neighbors. The letter said my water collection system constituted an unauthorized exterior utility modification, an alteration of drainage patterns, and a threat to aesthetic and operational uniformity. It gave me 21 days to remove the system and restore the property to approved condition. At the bottom was Marla Griggs' signature, big and sharp, like she had stabbed the page with the pen. I stood in my kitchen reading it while the dishwasher hummed behind me, and I remember feeling this odd little calm settle over me. Not anger yet, more like when you hear a rattlesnake before you see it. I drove to the HOA office that afternoon because I still believed, foolishly, that a normal conversation could fix an abnormal person with a title. Marla was behind a desk when I walked in. Late 60s, silver hair sprayed into place, curls at her neck, glasses hanging from a chain. Every inch of her arranged to communicate that she had once been underestimated and had never forgiven the world for it. She did not ask me to sit. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "we were expecting you." I held up the letter and said, "Then I guess you know why I am here." She folded her hands on the desk. "Your installation was not submitted for architectural review. It is a private water infrastructure system, and those are not permitted under Silverthorne guidelines." I said, "It is rain off my roof going into a tank under my yard." Her smile barely moved. "That is your interpretation." I leaned on the back of the chair she had not offered me and said, "No, Marla, that is gravity." Her eyes narrowed just enough for me to know I had crossed from resident into problem. She told me every homeowner agreed to abide by association rules, that independent systems created enforcement difficulties, that the community depended on shared sacrifice and consistent standards. I told her state law allowed residential rainwater harvesting, and nothing in the bylaws gave the HOA ownership of water falling on my roof. That was when she stopped pretending this was about gutters. "Mr. Mercer," she said, voice soft as dust, "communities fail when individuals decide they're exempt." I looked at her for a second, really looked at her, and I saw it then. The fear behind all that authority. It was not fear of flooding, or ugly pipes, or drainage. It was fear of someone stepping outside the system she controlled. I said, "I am not exempt from the rules, but I am also not owned by them." She pushed the letter across the desk like she was sliding me a court sentence. 21 days. I took it, nodded, and said, "You have a nice afternoon." Hank was waiting by my fence when I got home, pretending to inspect a creosote bush like that man had ever cared about landscaping in his life. "How bad was it?" he asked. I said, "She wants the whole thing removed." He whistled low. "You going to do it?" I looked at the clean gravel where the cistern was buried, at the gutters catching late sunlight, at the one useful thing I had built since my life had gone quiet, and I said, "No." Hank rubbed the back of his neck and gave me this tired little grin. "Owen, I am saying this with love. That woman has nothing to do all day but sharpen knives nobody can see." I said, "Good," because I just found my whetstone. 21 days later, the fine arrived, $275. I paid it online in under 3 minutes, then forwarded the receipt to the HOA office with a message that said, "Received, thank you." Maybe that was petty. Actually, no. It was definitely petty. But grief does strange things to a man. Sometimes you cry in grocery store parking lots for no reason, and sometimes you respond to bureaucratic bullying by buying 4 above-ground storage barrels and installing them along the side of your house in full compliance with setback rules. By the end of that weekend, my system had nearly doubled in usable capacity, and the barrels, I made sure of this, were painted the exact approved shade of desert taupe from the HOA color chart. Hank stood there watching me tighten the last valve and said, "You know you are poking the hornet's nest." I wiped my hands on a rag and said, "Hank, they mailed me the hornets." I just opened the box. For a while, it was almost funny. Letters came. Fines came. Marla drove past my house slower than necessary in her white Lexus, the way old sheriffs ride through town in westerns, except instead of a badge, she had a clipboard and unresolved control issues. Then the drought arrived, and there is nothing funny about a desert neighborhood running out of water. It started with the small things first. The kind people try to laugh off because the alternative is admitting they are scared. A neighbor would say the pressure in the shower felt weak. Somebody else would joke that their dishwasher sounded like it was coughing up gravel. Hank told me his wife had started filling old milk jugs just in case. And then, right around the second week of July, the HOA called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. Now, if you've never attended an emergency HOA meeting in a desert subdivision, imagine a church service, a hostage negotiation, and a middle school parent night all happening in the same beige room. People were packed into folding chairs, arms crossed, faces shiny from the heat, everyone pretending they were calm while staring at the water cooler in the corner like it was holy. Marla stood at the front beside two board members and a projected chart showing the well level dropping like a band stock. She had dressed for authority, cream blazer, pearl earrings, that same frozen smile. But even from the back row, I could see the tightness around her mouth. She told us Silverthorne was entering Stage 3 conservation measures effective immediately. No landscape watering, no car washing, no filling pools. Not that anybody with sense had a pool out there. Showers were to be limited to 5 minutes per person per day, and any household using more than the assigned monthly amount would face enhanced penalties. Somebody in the front asked what enhanced meant. Marla said, significant. That is how people with power talk when they want your imagination to do the threatening for them. I sat in the back with Hank, listening to the room turn restless. A young mother named Elena Cruz asked what families with small kids were supposed to do if the restrictions got worse. A contractor named Pete Harlan wanted to know why we were still paying the full water fee if the water was being rationed. Old Mr. Nolan, who lived alone and complained professionally, stood up and said he had warned everyone years ago that the well pump sounded wrong, which was not helpful but seemed to make him feel alive. Marla kept bringing everything back to unity, shared burden, community survival, and I understood part of it. I really did. A shared well only works if people respect limits. But every time she said shared burden, her eyes drifted toward me, because my burden was not shared in the way she wanted. That evening, after the meeting, I watered my vegetable beds slowly from my stored rainwater, not to make a point, not at first, but because the soil was cracking and the plants needed it. The smell of wet dirt rose up in the heat, sweet and almost sad, and I remember thinking my wife would have liked that smell. She used to say the desert only looked dead to people who were in a hurry. I was standing there with the hose when Hank came over, leaned on the fence, and gave me the look a man gives another man when he is trying not to say I told you so too early. You know folks can see this. Right, he said. I said, they can see me watering, yes. He nodded toward the street. They cannot see where the water comes from. That was the problem, of course. In a neighborhood where every lawn was turning the color of burnt toast, my little strip of green looked like arrogance. Within a week, people were slowing down when they passed my house. A couple stopped waving. Somebody left an anonymous note under my windshield that said, "Must be nice." I wanted to write back, yes. Planning ahead often is, but I resisted because, contrary to the evidence, I am capable of maturity in short bursts. Then Marla came back. And this time she did not come alone. It was late afternoon, the sun low and flat, when a white Lexus pulled up with a county deputy behind it. Hank saw them before I did, and called from his porch. "Owen, company." Marla marched up my walkway with a folder in one hand, and Deputy Ray Calder behind her. A broad man with tired eyes who looked like he had been dragged into exactly the kind of nonsense that made him question public service. I opened the door and Marla did not say hello. "Mr. But, Mercer, we have credible reports that you are violating emergency water restrictions and possibly drawing from the community supply through an unauthorized bypass." I looked past her at the deputy. "Ray, is it?" He nodded. I said, "She made you drive all the way out here for a garden hose." The corner of his mouth twitched, but he stayed professional. Marla cut in. "This is not a joke. Residents are sacrificing. Some are afraid they will not have water by next month. And you are maintaining landscaping as if the rules do not apply to you." I said, "The rules on shared well usage do not apply to water I collected myself." She stepped closer, lowering her voice like she was doing me some great favor by not shouting. "You do not get to opt out of a community because you found some clever little exception." I remember feeling my patience finally split, not explode, just split clean down the middle. I said, "Marla, it is not an exception. It is my roof, my tank, my pump, my water." She said, "Prove it." So I did. I walked them around the side yard, past the approved tote barrels she hated so much. past the filters mounted neat against the wall, then into the back where the buried cistern access cap sat flush with the gravel. I explained the flow, the screens, the first flush diverter, the storage capacity, the separate pump line that had no tie into the HOA supply. Deputy Calder asked practical questions. Where does this line go? How's it powered? Is there a cross connection? I answered all of it because, unlike Marla, he seemed interested in reality. Finally, he stood up, dusted his hands, and said, Maram, I do not see evidence of theft or tampering. If this system is separate, that sounds civil at most. Marla looked at him like he had betrayed civilization. We will handle the civil side, she said. Then she turned to me and smiled, but there was no friendliness left in it. You may enjoy being technically correct, Mr. Mercer, but technicalities have consequences. I said, so does overreach. She left without another word. But that was not the end. It was the beginning of the ugly part. The letters became thicker. The tone changed. The fines increased from annoying to deliberately painful. The HOA accused me of willful non-compliance, undermining emergency policy, and creating resident hostility. That last one almost made me laugh, because I did not create resident hostility. I just became the most convenient place to park it. Hank came over one night with 2 beers and sat with me on the tailgate of my truck while the sky bruised purple over the ridge. He said, People are mad, Owen. I said, I noticed. He took a drink and stared toward Marla's house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Some of them are mad at her too, but you are easier. You have a face and green tomatoes. I said, I never told anybody not to build their own system. Hank nodded. No, but you knew how, and they did not. People hate needing someone else's knowledge almost as much as they hate needing someone else's permission. That stuck with me because it was true. I had spent my whole life rooting landscapes other people drove over. I knew things that were invisible until they mattered. And now one of those invisible things was sitting in a deed folder in my office. The next morning, after receiving a notice threatening a lien on my property, I stopped treating Marla like a nuisance and started treating the HOA like a legal opponent. I called a woman named Vivian Rusk, a water rights attorney in Santa Fe I had worked with years earlier on a ranch dispute near Socorro. Vivian had a dry voice, no patience for drama, and the unsettling habit of going silent for long stretches while reading documents, which is how you know an attorney's either very good or asleep. I sent her everything. My deed, the subdivision plats, the old Marlowe tract records, the HOA water agreement, the well location map from the county filing. For nearly a minute, I heard nothing but paper moving on her end. Then she said, Owen, did anyone discuss this with you at closing? I said, the subsurface language. No, I found it myself. Another silence. Then she said, I need you to listen carefully. Based on the old parcel descriptions, your retained water interest may extend beyond your lot. I said, I know it reaches part of the open tract behind me. She said, not just behind you. I sat up. Vivian said, if this survey overlay is correct, the community well is inside the subsurface rights corridor attached to your property. I did not speak for a few seconds. Outside my office window, a dust devil crossed the road and came apart near Hank's mailbox. Finally, I said, they've been selling water from under my rights. Vivian said, possibly, yes. Without an easement, lease, or extraction agreement, that becomes a very different fight. That sentence changed the temperature in the room. All at once, Marla's letters, her threats, her speeches about unity, the fines, the deputy visit, all of it rearranged itself into something almost absurd. The HOA had been acting like I was stealing from them, while they might have been drawing from water rights they had never secured in the first place. Vivian warned me not to get excited. Lawyers love saying that right before telling you something explosive. She said we needed confirmation, county records, a modern survey overlay, chain of title review, and if it checks out, we could seek an injunction to halt extraction pending formal resolution. Halt extraction. That meant shutting down the well. Maybe not forever, but immediately enough to hurt. I thought about Helena and her kids. I thought about Hank filling milk jugs. I thought about every person in Silverthorne who had never signed Marla's letters or threatened my house. Then I thought about Marla sitting behind that desk telling me I was not allowed to be independent because independence made enforcement difficult. There is a point where compromise stops being kindness and becomes permission. So I told Vivian to move forward. The petition was filed the following week. The HOA response came fast. First by email, then through their attorney, then finally through Marla herself, who appeared at my door just before sunset with no pearls this time, only anger. "What have you done?" she said. I stood in the doorway and said, "I asked a judge to decide who has the right to that water." She laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You were trying to cut off 56 homes because your feelings were hurt over a fine." I said, "No. I am trying to stop an association from taking resources it never bothered to legally secure." Her face flushed. "People need that water," I said. "Then you should have made sure you had the right to use it before you built a whole neighborhood on top of assumptions." For the first time since I had met her, Marla looked less like a president and more like a person standing too close to a cliff. She whispered, "You will turn everyone against you." I said, "You already tried that." The hearing was set quickly because water does not wait for anyone's calendar. It was not dramatic in the way movies teach you to expect. No shouting, no surprise witness bursting through doors, no judge banging a gavel like a thunderclap, just fluorescent lights, thick binders, maps on easels, Vivian speaking in that calm desert dry voice, and Marla at the other table looking smaller than she had in her office. Vivian walked through the chain of title, the old Marlow tract division, the retained subsurface water interests, the well permit location, and the missing agreement between the HOA and the rights holder, which was me. The HOA attorney argued historical usage, community dependence, implied consent, emergency necessity. Some of it sounded reasonable if you forgot to ask the one question that mattered. The judge did not forget. He looked over his glasses at the HOA attorney and said, "Are you telling this court the association has operated this well for years without a recorded extraction agreement from the party holding the relevant subsurface rights?" The attorney opened his mouth, closed it, then began a sentence with, "Your Honor, it has always been understood." The judge interrupted him gently, which somehow made it worse. Understood by whom? The room went quiet. I glanced at Marla, and she was staring at the table. I did not feel proud in that moment. I thought I would, but I did not. I felt tired. I felt old. I felt like everyone in that room had arrived at a disaster that could have been avoided if one person in power had known the difference between authority and ownership. The ruling came before noon. The judge granted the temporary injunction. The HOA had 24 hours to cease groundwater extraction from the disputed well unless and until a formal access agreement was reached or the matter was fully resolved. Just like that. The thing everyone depended on became a machine they were no longer allowed to turn on. Vivian touched my shoulder as we walked out and said, "You got what you asked for." I looked across the parking lot at Marla, standing beside her Lexus with her phone pressed to her ear, already explaining the impossible to someone who was not going to take it well, and I said, "Yeah, I know." That was the problem. Because winning in court is one thing. Watching an entire neighborhood run out of water because you won is something else entirely. The well shut off the next afternoon, not with some dramatic siren or emergency broadcast, just a quiet mechanical stop somewhere below the desert floor. And somehow that made it worse, because 1 minute Silverthorne Ranch was still pretending this was a legal disagreement between grown adults, and the next minute 56 homes were turning faucets and hearing air. I was in my kitchen when it happened, standing over the sink with a glass in my hand, and even though I knew the order, even though I had asked for it, that dry little cough from the tap still landed in my chest like a stone. Across the road, Pete Harlan came out of his garage, twisted the handle on his hose, waited, then stared at the nozzle like it had personally lied to him. He looked over at me, not angry exactly, more stunned, and called out, "Owen, tell me this is temporary." I said, "Is it supposed to be?" He nodded once, but not like he believed me, more like he needed his body to do something while his brain caught up. By dinner, the HOA had sent out emergency texts, emails, and printed notices taped to doors, all saying the same careful thing in different ways. Water delivery was being arranged. Residents should conserve stored water. The association was working with council. Please remain calm. Please remain calm is what people say when calm has already left the building. The trucks arrived the next morning. Big silver tankers grinding up roads designed for golf carts and delivery vans. Hoses dragged across driveways. Temporary tanks dropped near the clubhouse. Men in reflective vests shouting over diesel engines while neighbors stood around in pajama pants holding buckets and plastic containers. It would have been almost comical if it had not been so humiliating for everyone involved. I saw Elena Cruz trying to keep her little boy from running under a hose while balancing a toddler on her hip, and for a second I hated myself a little, not because I thought I was wrong, but because being right did not make that scene easier to watch. The numbers got around fast, because numbers always do when people are scared. $5,000 a day for water delivery, then more for storage, more for emergency distribution, more for repairs after one tanker cracked the edge of the entry road. People who had been mad at Marla started getting mad at me too, because Marla had paperwork and excuses, while I had water. That was the simple version. And simple versions travel faster than truth. At the mailbox one afternoon, Mrs. Nolan said, under her breath, "Some people like watching others suffer." I turned around and said, "Marem, if I liked watching people suffer, I would attend more HOA meetings." She did not laugh. Hank did, but quietly, because Hank wanted to live. The worst part was not the insults, though. It was the silence, the way conversations dips when I walked past, the way blinds shifted, the way people looked at my house like it had become a bunker instead of a home. My garden was still alive. My tanks were still full. And in a crisis, preparedness can look a lot like selfishness from the outside. 2 days into the shutdown, Marla came to my door, no Lexus parked at an angle, no folder pressed to her chest, no pearls, no board members behind her, just Marla Griggs standing on my porch in the hard afternoon light looking like she had aged 10 years since court. Her hair was still fixed, but not perfectly. Her lipstick had worn off. Her eyes were red in a way that made me understand she had either been crying or had not slept. "Maybe both," she said. "We need to talk." I stepped back and let her in. For a moment, she just stood in my living room, looking at the framed photo of my wife on the shelf, then at the rain gauge near the window, then down at her own hands. "This is costing us more than we can handle," she said. "People are scared. Some of them are furious." I said, "I know." She looked up then, and there was a flash of the old Marla in her eyes. "Do you?" I could have snapped back. I had a whole list ready in my head. Every fine, every threat, every time she treated me like a disobedient child on my own property. But the woman standing in front of me was not the queen of beige paint anymore. She was somebody who had built her authority on assumptions, and now those assumptions were collapsing in public. So I said, "Yes, I do. I do not want kids filling buckets from tanker trucks any more than you do." Her shoulders dropped just a little. "What do you want, Owen?" It was the first honest question she had ever asked me. I took a breath and said, "All fines and violation notices against me are cancelled. Permanently." She nodded before I finished. "Done," I said. "The HOA gives me written acknowledgement that my rainwater system is independent, legal, and not subject to shared well restrictions as long as it remains separate." She swallowed. "Fine," I said. "The association signs a temporary extraction lease for the disputed well, with monthly payments, emergency limits, and a hard deadline to develop a legally independent source." Her face tightened. "How much?" I said. $18,000 upfront for past unauthorized extraction, then a monthly access fee until you're off my rights. She stared at me like I had reached across the room and slapped the air out of her. $18,000. Owen, we do not have that kind of cushion. I said, "Marla, you have been collecting water fees for years on a well you never secured. That is not my mistake." Her jaw worked, but no words came out. Then, very quietly, she said, "If we agree, you will lift the injunction." I said, "I will authorize limited access under a signed agreement by tonight. Not forever, not free, and not under the old arrangement." She sat down then, slowly, like her knees had finally received the news the rest of her body already knew. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Then she looked at my wife's picture again and said, "My husband used to tell me I treated every disagreement like an invasion." I said, "Sounds like a smart man." She gave this tiny broken laugh, the kind that is half apology and half surrender. He was. The agreement was signed before midnight. Vivian handled the language. The HOA attorney stopped trying to sound offended once he realized the alternative was another day of tanker bills, and by morning the well was running again under terms that actually had signatures behind them. Nobody threw me a parade, obviously. If anything, the neighborhood got weirder for a while, because people had to decide whether they hated me, resented Marla, or simply wanted the shower long enough to stop thinking about both of us. 3 months later, the HOA drilled a new well outside my subsurface corridor, properly permitted, properly surveyed, painfully expensive. The final cost was somewhere around $260,000 after engineering, drilling, road repair, legal fees, and emergency water deliveries. A special assessment went out to every homeowner, except me, because Ribian made sure the settlement carved me out. Hank came over holding his notice and said, "I should have let you inspect my deed when I bought the place." I said, "You should have let anybody inspect your decision-making." He laughed and said, "Fair." Marla resigned at the next annual meeting. She did not make a speech. She just sat in the front row while the younger guy named Trevor Mills, who owned a solar company and wore sneakers with a suit, got voted in on the platform of transparency, infrastructure review, and not picking fights with hydrologists. Marla moved away about 6 weeks later. I heard from Hank that the assessment was part of it, but not all of it. Pride is expensive too, and sometimes people leave because staying means being reminded every day of who they were when they had power. I did not celebrate. That surprised some people. Maybe it surprises you. But by then the whole thing felt less like revenge and more like standing in the wreckage after a storm you helped name. Silverthorne is quieter now. The new well works. The roads are patched. My rainwater system still sits there doing exactly what it was built to do, catching what falls, storing what would have been lost, minding its own business better than most people do. Every now and then, when the dry season stretches too long, somebody knocks and asks if I can spare a few hundred gallons for trees, livestock, or a garden they are trying not to lose. And I usually say yes. I charge a little, less than market. Enough so nobody mistakes kindness for obligation. Hank says I am becoming the neighborhood water baron, which is rich coming from a man who still owes me a socket wrench from last spring. Some evenings I sit out back as the sun drops behind the ridge, the barrels glowing dull brown in the light, the cistern buried silent under the gravel. And I think about how close all of this came to being just another story where someone with a title tells someone without one to shut up and comply. Legally, I know where I stand. The documents were clear. The judge was clear. Even Marla, in the end, knew it. But morally, I still turn it over in my head. I protected what was mine, but I also forced a crisis onto people who had not written those letters. People who just wanted baths for their kids and coffee in the morning and water to come out when they turned the handle. So I will ask you the question I still ask myself. If you found out your HOA had been bullying you while using a resource they never had the right to control, would you shut the whole system down to make them face it? Or would you swallow the insult to protect the neighbors caught in the middle? Was I standing up for myself? Or did I take it too far? Drop your honest take in the comments, because I have heard the legal answer, but I am still not sure the human one is that simple.